that big lie. We need to has been with a good bit of momentum to help the new Congress, the 117th Congress, that's going to be one of the closest divided Congresses ever. But we can stay together if we stay unified. It doesn't mean we have to be unanimous on everything. We can disagree on many things and still be unified. That's what we want to do. So I want to thank you for all you do. So let me close on a very personal note. I've been referring to Alexa Tocqueville a lot these days, and I want to close with a line from his 2-volume work, Democracy in America. The Tocqueville said, America is not great because we are more enlightened than any other nation, but rather because we have always been able to repair our faults. COVID-19 has opened up some fault lines in America. We must display our greatness by closing and repairing those fault lines. We've got to do what we're taught to do by our faith. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and do unto others as we will have them do unto us. I'll yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Whip. We appreciate all of your words and what we could not have had better words to kick off this hearing. It gives me great honor at this time to introduce someone who needs no introduction. And thank you, Mr. Leader, for calling him the person that puts us on the good foot, the person that we watch on his own TV show, the person who stands up for justice and has been in the civil rights fight, fighting with us, fighting for us, and leading us. Someone that I am honored to call my friend and who called on us early. I want it to be clear. This is not something that was added. This is someone who came to us and said, let's do this together. No other than the Reverend Al Sharpton, National Action Network. Reverend, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for your leadership and your standing up for justice down through the years, and including joining you in your district just last week, a day before this insurrection and attempted coup d'etat in Columbus, Ohio, as you helped us funeralize a victim, an unarmed victim who was killed by police in Columbus, Ohio, your district. Let me say that what is very appalling to those of us in National Action Network is that when we watched what happened, the siege of the capital of the United States that showed around the world an instability of the American government. If that had happened in any other nation where there was an election that had been held fairly, that if observers had deemed it to be held fairly, and that the vote count was correct, that therefore the articles from that election being presented before the Electoral College that voted and were certifying that vote on the day of this insurrection. It was the intent of those that came to the Capitol to interfere with the certification of the Electoral College vote, which meant their intent was to undermine the peaceful transfer of power to those that had won the election. In any other country, we would have been talking about whether we would send in military aid to support the democratic process. It happened in this country, and we should not tolerate it, and those responsible ought to be prosecuted to the fuller degree of the law. What was most disturbing to us is last August, National Action Network and I, with Martin Luther King III, had called a commitment march in Washington, D.C. around the issues of the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act and the John Lewis Voting Act. And we rallied over 200,000 people, had the families of police victims. We were joined by Youth Chair Lady Beatty and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus. But what people don't understand, which is particularly of concern to us watching this insurrection, is that in leading up to being able to do that march, as we have experienced at other marches we've done in Washington, we had to meet with various federal agencies and law enforcement to get the permit to even have the march. We met Ebony Riley, our able bureau director of National Action Network in our DC office, and her staff had to meet with 26 different federal agencies and meet with the National Park Services and meet with DC as well as Capitol Police, as well as other entities, including Homeland Security. Give them grants, let them know where the staging would be, where the people would be, where the route would be that we would march across the mall after the rally to the Martin Luther King Monument, had to lay out the map. All of this had to be pre-approved, had to have walkthroughs, and had it all certified, and was told that we had to be COVID-19 protocol abide by that, which led us to spending tens of thousands of dollars to buy thermometers, to get everyone's temperature coming into the march, and face masks. All of this had to be laid out before we were given a permit to go on the National Mall to the Lincoln Memorial and march after the rally across the mall to the Martin Luther King Monument. We had to also post a multi-million-dollar insurance bond so that if anything went wrong, we were liable. I would say to this caucus, were those procedures also put in place and required to give a permit for this gathering that happened on the very same National Mall? And whether or not they had to have all of those procedures monitored and agreed upon. Did they post an insurance bond? If they did, who was the responsible parties and or organizations? Who posted the bond? Who was responsible? And what was the COVID regulations they were given to follow? I would also add that we were told that we had to have people that would be on call, that if anything happened, as they observed anything, people on the site during the rally, during the march, would be called. Well, who were the people that they had designated? Particularly since the speaker at our march were the victims of police and racial violence, and myself, Martin III, and Dr. King's granddaughter, Yolanda. The speakers at this rally, they had the insurrection, was the President of the United States, which means that we would assume they had even more heightened security. And it was the president that led off the march, directed them and said, we're going to walk to the Capitol, and said he was going to join them. So we must examine who took responsibility, what procedures were taking place, who did they meet with, or did they march without a permit, or did someone look the other way? Whether or not this was done outside of what is the norm that we've had to go through on several occasions. I would also suggest to you, Madam Chair Lady and members of the caucus, that we need to look into the fact that some of those that have participated in defending what happened have themselves done things that would suggest they were quite familiar with this. On September 16, 1992, there was a police rally, off-duty police, protesting a civilian review board in New York City by then Mayor David Dinkins, the first and only Black mayor of this city, where I'm sitting today, 10,000 police officers marched on City Hall, became violent at City Hall just as the violence was seen at the Capitol last Wednesday. And cars were turned over, glasses was broke. The speaker at that rally was Rudolph Giuliani, the present lawyer for the President of the United States. At the same time period within that same year, the president, then a private citizen, had bought full-page ads calling for the execution of 5 young men for their alleged participation in the rape in a despicable act against a white female in Central Park. He called for their execution, paid for ads. They were later found to be innocent. So they have a background in being around this kind of anarchy, which should make them even more conscious and more careful when you're dealing with a mob, unless in fact that mob was operating in the spirit that they know is not only possible, but probable, since the president said, come to the rally, we're gonna have a wild time. Clearly, we're dealing with people that marched through the halls, the hollow halls of the Capitol, holding Confederate flags that now my good friend Congressman Clyburn has said was not a Confederate flag, but a flag of white supremacy. Yes, they had gallows set up that reminds us of where they set up people for lynching. So clearly, we're calling on the Congressional Black Caucus under your esteemed leadership to investigate what engagement the federal government had to make this a permitted event.
Thank you so much, Sharpton. We appreciate it. Let me make a brief announcement. It has been brought to our attention. We will be voting on the articles of impeachment momentarily. So I am going to move quickly through this part of our hearing because we have congressional moments to be entered into the record. I'm going to forego formal announcements because all of you stand on your name and your reputation. With that, I will go to Marc Morial, who is the president and CEO of the National Urban League and also part of the journey and like-mindedness for calling today's hearing. Marc Morial.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Beatty, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for your leadership in building this collaboration to shed light on the awful events of last week. I also want to thank my friend and partner in civil rights, Reverend Al Sharpton, for his testimony and leadership, and always James Clyburn, the elder statesperson of civil rights and Black politics in America, for his insight. I'm inspired today by the words of James Baldwin, who wrote, "I love America more than any other country in this world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." So here's my testimony. On June 2nd, 2020, racial justice protesters peacefully gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to protest the death of George Floyd and other Black Americans at the hands of the police. They were met with row upon row of military police in fatigues and armor lining the memorial steps. The day before, on June 1st, at least 9 military and police aircraft hovered in the sky over Washington. 2 helicopters eventually swooped low in a tactic usually reserved for combat zones, battering protesters with tropical storm level winds. Park police infamously unleashed tear gas and fired rubber bullets to clear a nonviolent crowd from Lafayette Park so that President Trump could stage a photo op. DC Metropolitan Police arrested 316 protesters on June 1st, 2020. The FBI knew that extremists were preparing to travel to Washington to commit violence and war on January 6th. The insurrection was openly plotted on social media. One post on the platform, 8KUN, declared, "We will storm the government buildings, kill cops, kill security guards, kill federal employees and agents." There were no National Guard troops in riot gear awaiting them. No military helicopters, no tear gas deployed as the mob shoved its way past barricades. Vastly outnumbered police stepped aside and allowed the mob to storm the Capitol. DC Metropolitan Police made only 61 unrest-related arrests on January 6th. U.S. Capitol Police arrested just over a dozen. Many Capitol Police executed their duty bravely and with honor. Officer Eugene Goodman is being hailed as a hero for luring a mob away from the Senate chamber. However, another officer did exactly the opposite, offering the rioters directions around the building as he donned a Make America Great cap. January 6th may have been one of the most egregious examples, but it's certainly not the first. Over and over again, in the eyes of far too many law enforcement officers, Black people are considered a threat simply for existing, while violent white people are cosseted, protected, pampered, and indulged. Even the author of the FBI report warning of the mob's murderous intent worried that a show of force might encroach on the rioters' free speech rights. Lieutenant General Walter E. Pyatt, director of the Army staff, rebuffed requests for National Guard assistance because he didn't like the visual, a concern nowhere in evidence during Black Lives Matter protests, civil rights protests, or any other protests that African Americans and other people of color have been engaged in to protect our rights over the years. In fact, much of the violence at racial justice protests over the summer was instigated by white supremacists and far-right extremists, yet this violence was used to rationalize military-level crackdowns on peaceful protesters. Operation Relentless Pursuit and Operation Legend, cynically named for a 4-year-old killed in a shooting that had no link to racial protests, sent federal officers to override local law enforcement in Black communities. Far from trying to contain a violent insurrection where the symbols of white supremacy were on full display, police officers are rightfully under investigation, some that is, for actively participating. On June 6th, we witnessed a violent mob motivated by racial resentment, by a conspiracy theory rooted in the effort to invalidate Black votes. The mob was met with empathy and deference from some in law enforcement and some in a military establishment that harbors white supremacists, let's say it, amongst its own ranks. The national reckoning over racially motivated police misconduct and brutality that began this summer cannot move forward until the institutions entrusted with public safety and national security rid themselves of the cancer within. We cannot heed the hollow cries for unity from the very collaborators who fanned the flames of insurrection and promoted racist lies. You cannot cure cancer by ignoring it. It must be cut out and burned away. Reform efforts such as the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act are a necessary step, but only one part of the solution. We must use every means at our disposal to shine a light on racial injustice and fully commit as a nation to a zero tolerance policy with regard to white supremacy in law enforcement and in the military and across this land.
Thank
We're
you
truly
so much.
at a
Thank you. We have to move on, and we will allow all witnesses to also be able to submit and extend their remarks by written testimony. We also would like to say we have thousands of people who are also watching us now on Facebook Live, and we will have time hopefully at the end. But at this time, I'm going to have to move the hearing along. And I am very honored that we have our distinguished mayor of the District of Columbia, Mayor Muriel Bowser.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for inviting me today. I want to acknowledge and appreciate all the members of this esteemed caucus, and thank you for taking swift action by hosting this emergency hearing on the acts of domestic terrorism and sedition that unfolded in our nation's capital just 1 week ago. I was able to hear the remarks of my friend, Reverend Al and Marc Morial, and I want to thank them for their testimony. I listened very carefully to Reverend Al's remarks because I know how much he knows and Nan knows how to do things appropriately in the nation's mall and make sure people's voices are heard. I am Muriel Bowser. I'm the mayor of Washington, D.C., and I'm honored to present testimony before you. I want to begin by thanking my residents of the District of Columbia for heeding our call to stay home and to not engage with the thugs who came to our city seeking violence and confrontation. I think what history will show is that Black Lives Matter protesters, DC residents and residents of Maryland and Virginia who love peace and want justice did not engage with those people. And it is clear who caused the damage to the Capitol, to the sense of safety of our members of Congress, and to our historic building. I want to offer special thanks to the men and women of the Metropolitan Police Department, or DC Police, and DC Fire and EMS for responding to the United States Capitol Police request for backup and helping to restore order to the Capitol building. They put their lives on the line to secure and defend our democracy, ensuring that the members of Congress who displayed great bravery could return to vote in the very chambers where DC residents are denied representation and a vote. I want to thank them for their heroic actions that day because I know much bodily harm was avoided. They are the true patriots. You are the true patriots. I want to thank our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia as well for their support for the Maryland and Virginia guards and the law enforcement that they sent in advance of that day. And while MPD was able to rush to the scene after a call for help, we also know that members of the DC National Guard, by the way, DC National Guard is a somewhat of a misnomer because DC doesn't actually have its own guard. The DC National Guard is the President's Guard. And unlike all of the states, the people of Washington do not control their guard. To ensure that this never happens again, I'm calling on Congress to immediately transfer command of the DC National Guard from the President and put it squarely under the command and control of the Mayor of Washington, DC. And to ultimately fix the unworkable status of federal interference and control over matters in the district, we must get Congresswoman Norton's DC statehood bill, HR 51, passed and on the president's desk within the first 100 days of the 117th Congress. Again, I'm encouraged by the actions taken by federal law enforcement thus far to get ready for this unprecedented inauguration, but we know more work must happen. I'm calling on the Joint Terrorism Task Force to investigate, arrest, and prosecute any individual who entered the Capitol, destroyed property, or incited the acts of domestic terrorism observed last week. I urge the Congress to create a nonpartisan commission to understand the catastrophic security failures and both to hold people accountable and ensure that it never happens again. It is not lost on me, as we heard in President Morial's comments, who stoked the flames of this extremism and on January 6th, encouraged the acts of terrorism and sedition that we saw that resulted in the deaths of 2 United States Capitol Police officers and 4 others. As you have heard today, the members of the Congressional Black Caucus know better than most that there is an inextricable tie between those terrorists and white nationalism. The symbols, speech, and actions were undeniable. And this is not the end. This is the beginning of us needing as a country to be focused on the radicalization of these mostly white men who we saw in the Capitol that day. And while these terrorists were met with a light hand from federal law enforcement, allowing them to overrun the Capitol, we did see a very different scene last summer when protesters who peacefully gathered at Black Lives Matter Plaza were met by battalions of armed federal troops in uniform and some unidentified. The undeniable difference of treatment and response cannot be ignored. We are already in the process of an unprecedented inaugural prep. We're working with our partners, both regional and federal, to ensure their plans are adequate to ensure the protection of life and property in the District of Columbia, and ultimately the peaceful transition of power for Joe Biden and Black Caucus member, Senator Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. We ask that all of those interested please watch from home and allow the Presidential Inauguration Committee, invited guests, and security personnel secure this event. As we prepare to inaugurate a new president, there is hope for our nation. We know that together, our shared American values and certainly our DC values will endure, but not without a fight. I thank the members here for all your hard work to enrich the lives of all Americans, and know that I stand ready to assist in any way that I can.
Thank you so much, Madam Mayor. We appreciate you. At this time, we will go to Malcolm Nance. We know him as an author. We see him as a commentator on terrorism, intelligence, and insurgency. Malcolm Nance.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing me to speak to all of you. And I'm going to run through my statement because I know you're all doing very, very important work today for the nation. On November 3rd, 2020, it was a triumphant day for American democracy. Vice President Joe Biden and Vice Presidential nominee Senator Kamala Harris defeated President Donald Trump and his Vice President Mike Pence to represent the American people. The story should have ended there with a peaceful transfer of power. However, from the moment the election was called, right-wing extremists on their private forums were discussing armed opposition to Joe Biden's administration and liberals in general. They started referring to the election of 2020 as stolen, calling the legitimate and certified democratic process a coup d'etat. Massive quantities of ammunition and guns were exchanging hands on public forums in response to a prospective insurrection. In the right-wing extremists underground, they were calling for Donald Trump to bring on the storm, the QAnon conspiracy belief that Trump should mass murder and or arrest Democrats who were all cannibalistic child sex traffickers. The phrase Democrat extinction was finding its way up from the darker parts of the internet to being openly posted on Facebook and right-wing Twitter and Parler. President Trump himself launched a call for election fraud and illegitimate election. He and his followers called it a coup, and not one Republican politician lifted a finger in opposition. Many would agree with Trump and his most violent supporters and stoke the flames that would light the fuse to the powder keg of rebellion. That explosion occurred on 6 January 2021 at the Trump Stop the Steal rally. At the direction of the president, the US Capitol was placed under siege without any security measures found in a national security event where the vice president-elect, the Speaker of the House, and the President of the Senate pro tem were assembled in one spot. President Trump launched his followers to seize control of the Capitol, and they sought to likely harm the members once found inside. We now know there were likely capture and kill teams roaming around looking to find elected members. Had they successfully found, incapacitated, or injured Vice President Pence, Senator Harris, Speaker Pelosi, and Senator Grassley, all of whom were in the same room, the United States government would have been decapitated and reduced to one man, Donald Trump, who would have been left unscathed and in power. Yet the uprising is not over. Indeed, this is only the beginning. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual authored by General David Petraeus in 2000, defines insurgency as an organized movement aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government through the use of subversion and armed conflict. Insurgencies are inherently about seizing political power through arms and political chaos action. Their principal goal is to make existing governments seem powerless, feckless, and incapable of protecting the common citizen. This will be the objective of the soon-to-be out-of-power Trump administration and the Republican Party holdovers who adhere to him. Trump and his family will not be going away with a fond farewell and cheery good wishes. They have already started to transform themselves into a malicious political opposition machine that intends to destroy the Biden administration and, in their own terms, liberalism in America on every level. The Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong optimized modern insurgency by giving it 3 phases. The first phase is the most important. It is when insurgents trying to gain populist legitimacy by tearing down a solidly elected government through extreme political positions, propaganda, and mob action. It is then followed by terrorism, armed resistance, and toppling government by civil war. Should President Trump remain politically viable, there will likely be a Trump party political wing that cues in the completely deniable militant wing as to where and when to sow chaos, conduct terrorism, and carry out armed actions with and without direct orders. 2021 will see the 4 wings of a prospective Trump movement: Trump, his family, the Republican Party hangers-on, their mainstream voters, and the armed militias, terrorist, and QAnon conspiracy cult will transform into an active insurgency, which will bring governance into chaos, set the stage for the collapse of the Democratic Party's coalition that defeated Trump. The armed contingents will likely join into an alliance of physical resistance forces and agitate for the largest rebellion since the Civil War. I call this gathering movement the Trump insurgency in the United States, or TITUS, T-I-T-U-S. It is wholly a white supremacist rebellion against the motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, from many one. They do not believe in any America except one of subjugation and white tribalism. Their inherent privilege gave them the ability to attack the Capitol of the United States, attempt to overpower law enforcement, capture and kill our elected representatives, and be ushered out of murdering a policeman as if they were a peaceful Iowa high school tour group. Our understandable desire to ignore the warning signs, which we all saw with our own eyes, to assume the work, and at time to temper their fervor, is akin to sitting on a one-legged stool at the lip of a lava-filled volcano and rationalizing because the final leg had not fallen off that all will be well. It is a terribly and undeniably real. America is in a state of rebellion stoked by one man's own elevation of white tribalism. The people who will man this terrorist insurgency will look like your neighbors. They will look like the local banker, car salesman, tax accountant, gas station owner, heating and cooling technician, because insurrectionists and insurgents are often one's own neighbors, and they want to change American discourse away from democracy to domination by force. Is this specter of the Trump insurgency just alarmist speculation? Hardly. Like coronavirus, they don't care what you think. They view American democratic liberalism as foreign, alien. The word they are calling us all now is communist, and justifiably eradicable. How do we diffuse the fire? For a start, the rule of law and the tenets of the Constitution must be held up as an anvil of justice. Many hundreds of insurrectionists must be held to account. It will be slow, politically distasteful, and people may lose their lives. To quote the immortal words of Jeanette Vasquez, whatever you're going to do, you better do it fast before these insurrectionists launch a full-blown, nationwide, white supremacist insurgency. Thank you all for listening to my remarks.
Thank you so much. Could not have received any better information at this time. Again, I am going to say not only to our witnesses, but to all those looking, the timing could not have been better. We are on the United States House floor giving our testimony and debate to the impeachment. Therefore, some of our members will be called away, such as our chairman, Hakeem Jeffries. We will insert him during the 1 minute time or when he returns. I will now read off the next few individuals to save time. Unfortunately, we are going to have to stick to the 5-minute rule. I've been advised by our operators that I will tap at 30 seconds and you will be muted at 5 seconds, only because we are part of history and we want this recorded before the vote. At this time, no stranger to the fight, no stranger to standing up for our power, our message than Alicia Garza, our good friend in CBC, co-founder of Black Lives Matter. She will be followed by the Honorable Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who has been speaking about our power, our message, followed by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, our power, our message, and rounded out by our very own Chair of Homeland Security, Congressman Benny Thompson. Back to you, my good friend, Alicia Garza.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair Beatty, for inviting my testimony today. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this incredible and important and timely hearing. My name is Alicia Garza. I'm the principal at the Black to the Future Action Fund, an organization that works to make Black communities powerful in politics so that we can be powerful in the rest of our lives. I am also one of the creators of the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which is now BLM Grassroots. My comments today represent the views of the Black to the Future Action Fund only. Honorable members of this committee, the insurrection at the United States Capitol building this week laid bare what too many of us have been warning about for years, that white supremacy is not only bad for America's health, and yet it is too often the engine that drives the rules that organize our lives. White supremacy and white nationalism is fueled by an anger at the power that Black communities build and wield, especially when it comes to elections. The president and his followers intend to invalidate the results of the last 2 elections, which is a blatant attempt to neutralize the power of Black voters to change the rules that have been rigged against our communities for generations. As we saw last week in their attempts to attack the government, they will stop at nothing to get their power back. And if they are successful, they intend to keep it. Members, as we approach the birthday of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I would like to remind you of the fierce urgency of now. Nearly 1 year ago, my organization released the Black Agenda 2020, a legislative roadmap to make Black Lives Matter from City Hall to Congress. The Black Agenda is informed by the Black Census Project, the largest survey of Black people in America in 156 years, conducted by my organization, the Black Futures Lab. The Black Agenda identified 6 key pillars needed to bring America closer to its promise. We call on this body to make haste in making Black communities powerful in our society by rejecting the toxic culture of white nationalism, by calling it out at every opportunity and in front of every audience. We need Congress to require data collection and regular reporting on white nationalist domestic terrorism in America so that we can dedicate adequate resources to addressing the problem. We need to better understand what efforts are being made to curb white nationalist violence. And in particular, we need to not only understand, but aggressively root out white nationalist and white supremacist actors in law enforcement agencies. Under this president specifically, but under the Republican agenda generally, oversight and accountability for civil rights has been effectively gutted. We call on this body to strengthen the Office of Civil Rights by requiring greater transparency, data collection, and reporting on their work to protect the civil rights of marginalized communities in America, and their work to hold to account those who would act to violate the civil rights of Americans through violence, intimidation, surveillance, and suppression. We also call on this body to refuse and reject any efforts to enact laws that do not address the specificity of white nationalist violence, and instead catch in their dragnet those people like myself who work tirelessly every single day to ensure the presence of a democracy and the promise of an America for all of us. Honorable members, earlier this year, my home was visited by the FBI, informing me that my name had been found written on an envelope alongside the names of elected officials and other activists in the home of a known white supremacist. Just as they had a duty to warn me of this potential threat, it is my duty to implore this body not to waste the opportunity to be the architects of a new America by enacting piecemeal and symbolic solutions to complex problems. We cannot afford symbolic measures that address that which threatens the lives of people like me, like you, every single day. Our job together is to undo the rules that have been rigged against our communities, replacing them with new rules that allow us to achieve the beloved community that we long for. We must stay focused on the task at hand and not be distracted by opportunities to be at the table when we have the opportunity to set the menu. If we are to lift every voice with substance and not just in symbol, we must ensure that we destroy the shackles that keep so many of us from rising and the weapon of white supremacy that intends to keep us from living with dignity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for speaking truth to power. Congresswoman Maxine Waters. We need to unmute you, Congresswoman Waters.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joyce Beatty, our newly elected chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. I thank you for immediately taking leadership and organizing this very important meeting based on our recent experience with the invasion of the Capitol of the United States by right-wing domestic terrorist organizations. I would like to share with you that what Al Sharpton had to say to you and what he was advising you of was extraordinarily important because in the final analysis, our security has not been attended to by us. We have left our security in the hands of those who are absolutely supposed to be in charge of security for the Capitol and all of us. But I, as an African-American woman, member of Congress, have been basically targeted so many times to be killed and have gone to the Capitol Police and to the Sergeant at Arms. And I had to force a meeting with Benny Thompson to try and make them provide not only security for me, but for others and other women of color in the caucus and in the Congress because our lives were being threatened. And so, with the knowledge that there was going to be a so-called protest movement, where the Capitol was going to be the target, I came to our Democratic caucus and I said, I think we should pay attention to the security arrangements. What do we know about what the Capitol Police are doing? What do we know about what the chief of police is doing? What do we know about the overall security organizing that is going to be desperately needed? Zoe Lofgren, who is head of our House Chair Administrative Committee, had the Capitol Chief of Police call me. And he called me and I spent 1 hour on the telephone with him. And I asked him every question that I could think of based on what I knew about security arrangements. I started out by asking him whether or not our plaza was going to be secured and whether or not the so-called protesters would have access to that area surrounding our Capitol. He assured me that they would not be on the plaza. He assured me that it would be barricaded. He assured me that I had nothing to worry about. And then I asked him about the grassy area adjacent to the plaza, and what if there were going to be opposing groups that would be there. He said, don't worry about that. We will have Capitol Police that will be stationed throughout all of those who are on the grassy area to ensure that if any confrontation takes place, they will be able to break it up. I asked him to give me the outline of the perimeter that was going to be established to keep away those who would be causing trouble. He did not do that. He basically started to tell me about the permitting process, which really must be scrutinized, really must be taken apart, really must be dealt with in the way that Reverend Sharpton talked about. I won't go into detail about how he told me that operates, but I asked him if he was going to block off Independence Avenue because of an incident that took place once when the so-called protesters were there opposing us on Obamacare, and Black Caucus members walked toward the Clinton building and some were spit upon. And so he said, well, I just want the members to use the underground tunnels and to not cross the street, be out where they can be identified. Okay, that was satisfactory. But I asked him about the Metropolitan Police, if he had the cooperation with them. He said, absolutely, they had the cooperation with them. And then I asked him if he absolutely knew the domestic terrorist groups who were well identified. And I pointed out to him that the Proud Boys were in town because that was public information. And he said to me that in the permitting process, that people did not have to identify the group. The individual who was requiring the permit would be sufficient to get a permit. And he went on to explain how that operated. That gave me some real pause and the opportunity to reflect on what I thought was missing there. But then my final kind of question for him was whether or not he was going to have police on top of our buildings, on top of the Capitol, because that's where, would-be assassins would work from. And I reminded him of Dr. Martin Luther King and John Kennedy and how they had been assassinated from high buildings, et cetera. He said to me, Ms. Waters, they can't get on the buildings. They would have to go through the Capitol in order to get to the top of the Capitol building. That won't happen. And so this long 1-hour conversation that I had him, he assured me that he was in charge, that he understood everything that was possible, and that they were organized in such a way there would be security. In the final analysis, this police chief either lied, he was incompetent, or he was complicit. And so now that I'm learning that he was alerted by the FBI and about police organizations from New York, that he was lying. And so I'm going to stay on this investigation. I'm going to be right in his face. I'm going to make sure that this information is shared because, ladies and gentlemen, it is not simply about the Capitol. It is about our communities. These are right-wing domestic terrorists who we are targeted by, and they intend to have power with this president, even after he is no longer the president. This president is headed toward a civil war, and we're the object of their hate. And so it is not only about protection and security for the Capitol and us. We need to talk about what we're going to do to force diversity and inclusion and protection for our communities. And with that, I know Joyce is signaling that it's time to get off of here, and I'm off. I got to go to the floor and testify on impeachment. I know something about impeachment. I've been calling for it since this president was elected. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. And that's my Madam Chairperson. So I give you that extra privilege. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, Congressman Benny Thompson for 5 minutes exact. And then we will turn it over to our 2 vice chairs because we have our very important congressional minutes by our members of Congress, which will be entered into our records.
Delighted, Madam Chair, with your leadership, and to all of those who've spoken, my friend Reverend Al Sharpton and Marc Morial. The idea of today is our power, our message. On January 6th, the chief insurrectionist who will be impeached today spoke for an hour to throngs of insurrectionists in a rally. His words were, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol." And his final words were, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong. In addition to his words, this crowd was filled with white supremacists, those who support Nazism, and many others. In addition, those individuals were clearly racist, as our police officers, who I give a great deal of gratitude for, most of them worked to fight back and protect the Congress. But Black officers were called the N-word. They were abused, and as they tried to do their work, and I'm very glad that the officer who was shown to distract the white supremacists, it has been clarified. But that is the atmosphere in which they were in. In addition, these individuals were carrying flags, signs, and symbols of racism. White supremacist groups and extremist groups were filled in that crowd. It was similar to the Colfax, Louisiana case in 1872, when those who were leading the government at that time were freedmen. White supremacists, white persons came and killed those in leadership position. In fact, there was a Black militia that turned themselves in, and they were killed after they turned themselves in, at least 50. We're in essence fighting a cold civil war, and it has been going on for 156 years. And it involves Black people who are fighting for civil rights, human rights, and civil liberties. Just as I was with Ben Crump, dealing with justice for Joshua in Lamarck, Texas, continually fighting against, as Black Lives Matter, police misconduct and Black men losing their lives. So why couldn't we be protected on January 6th? It is because of security failures that often come where there's no one concerned, a failure to imagine that the threats exist. These were patriots. They couldn't be coming for anything but peaceful First Amendment protests. That was untrue. They underestimated the violence of these individuals. An ineffective application of resources. These officers had no resources, no shields, no blocking equipment, no helmets, and they were obviously told to stand down. A lack of intelligence that they did not utilize, and of course, not recognizing the organizations that came, the Traditionalist Workers' Party, 3 Percenters, Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, QAnon, the Groper Army, Neo-Confederates, Neo-Nazis, and others. The rioters were trained and planned. They came to attack this place. It was led by Donald Trump. He fueled them since the election, lying and saying it was a fraudulent election. They were a mob. They were protected by their whiteness. We are engaged in a cold civil war, and it must be known for sure that the fired chief of police indicated that he told the sergeant at arms that we needed the National Guard, and it was ignored. Again, whiteness can kill you. Lies kill you. This is important to adhere to what Mayor Muriel Bowser has indicated. I support every aspect of her request. For the CBC, I believe we have to dispel the belief that happened last week is now in the past. We must end the discussions that only the vice president, the speaker, were the only people at risk. We were. We must stress that people came to Washington to do violence, and only a small fraction of the likely millions who empathize and sympathize. We must recognize that white supremacists permeate the whole society, and we as individuals in our committees must have hearings over and over again. We can do 2 things at once. We must not stop investigating. The work to ensure our democracy will not be completed unless the Congressional Black Caucus and activist civil rights organization continue unceasing to fight to end the cold civil war and to insist upon the justice to be rendered for all. This was a planned event, and we must fight against it. Lies kill. This is our power and our message.
Very powerful. Next, we have the chair of the Democratic Caucus, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, followed by the chair of Homeland Security, Congressman Benny Thompson. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your tremendous leadership and vision and pulling us all together for this incredibly important hearing for such a time as this. The United States of America is a great country. We have come a long way. But the events of January 6th, of course, revealed that we still have a long way to go. Systemic racism has been in the soil of America for 401 years, and we must rededicate ourselves to burying it in the ground, never to rise again. America is a country that was founded on high ideals, liberty and justice for all, the land of the free, the home of the brave. All men are created equally, entitled to things like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a country founded on high ideals. But we in the Congressional Black Caucus, of course, understand, the civil rights community and our leaders understand, the Black Lives Matter activists understand that America was founded with a birth defect, a genetic imperfection on the question of race. And for 240 years, we've been trying to deal with that. And every time America makes progress, and we have made progress, the lesson of history teaches us there always is a backlash. Progress made during the Emancipation and the Reconstruction era, with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But Reconstruction was cut short when the North pulled out of the South. We abandoned the project. Jim Crow rose up, the KKK rose up, Plessy versus Ferguson was decided, the Black codes were imposed. We were never given the promised 40 acres and a mule, and that lasted for almost 100 years. Then a new generation rose up, ushering in progress in the 50s and 60s as part of the civil rights movement and the Great Society, and then the backlash immediately followed with the election of Richard Nixon, anti-government, anti-affirmative action, anti-busing, and of course, the start of the failed war on drugs, which has resulted in 2.3 million people incarcerated, disproportionately Black and brown. Progress followed by backlash. Then Barack Obama rose up as a new hope. Some said we were entering into a post-racial America that lasted for perhaps a few days because the backlash was immediate. The Tea Party rose up saying they want their country back. What country was taken away from you? And then the Supreme Court in 2013 stripped large parts of the Voting Rights Act, ushering in a new era of voter suppression. It all culminated, we thought, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. But the January 6th insurrection that was a violent attack fueled by white supremacy was the culmination of the backlash. And so we just have to recognize that until we cut the cancer out, we will be living with this reality of progress and backlash here in America. White supremacy is a malignant tumor. It will eat America alive. And that's why we rededicate ourselves to the cause of finally burying systemic racism and continuing our long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. Thank you, Joyce. God bless you. God bless the CBC. And God bless the United States of America.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Congressman Benny Thompson will round out this part, and we will then hear from our congressional 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Beatty, for holding this important hearing. Today, we're here to discuss the domestic terrorist attack that took place at the United States Capitol on January 6th. I'd like to take a moment to offer my deepest condolences to the family of Orphan Brian Sicknick, who gave his life protecting the Capitol. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the officers who demonstrated courage in the face of violent insurrectionists, members of the media who put themselves in harm's way to tell this important story, and activists who continue to fight for change and equality in the face of hate and terror. Last week's attacks are indicative of the pervasive and persistent threat of domestic terrorism. Over the past 2 years under my chairmanship, the Homeland Security Committee has held 11 hearings. We raised the alarm time after time about the growing threat from right-wing extremists emboldened by the president's rhetoric. Our witnesses consistently testified that we were on the brink of a major event like the one we saw last Wednesday. What occurred last week was clearly domestic terrorism incited by President Trump through his speech that morning and his words and actions over the past 4 years, as well as his enablers seeking to overturn the results of a legitimate election. Never in my life did I expect to witness a sitting president openly incite violent extremists at a political rally and then tell them he loved them after they stormed the House and Senate chambers, raised the Confederate flag, and erected a noose. President Trump is a direct threat to the homeland and must be removed from office immediately. This attack was the result of a horrendous security failure. It was no secret that extremist groups, including people who want to start a civil war, plotted to commit acts of violence. Media outlets reported it extensively. It was the worst kept secret in this area that the Trumpsters were coming to town to stop the steal. In the days leading up to the attack, experts warned on social media posts openly called for violence. Why was there no better preparation and coordination between this administration, leadership of the Capitol Police, DC Police, and others? The alarms are flashing red for everyone to use. Madam Chair, it's clear something went awful wrong, but the double standard exists in security. The double standard exists based on black and white. White privilege is alive and well, and the Congressional Black Caucus has to mitigate it every time we see it. So what we will do from an oversight perspective is continue to document and agitate and be the conscience of Congress as we try to make these things better. It is clear that even some of our colleagues who are members of Congress, we're gonna have to look at their security clearances to make sure that they're not violating the oath when they have access to a lot of this information. They might be sharing it to the very same people who came into the Capitol and put all of us at risk. So we're gonna have to review this whole system. But more importantly, next Wednesday, we have a new president. We have to put on his plate in this first 100 days what real domestic terrorists look like in America. The FBI has produced information that it won't publish that says that the single greatest threat in America is a right-wing domestic terrorist threat. We plan to force them after next week to release that information so the entire public can see it. With that, Madam Chair, I thank you. I pledge the committee's support to continue to document the problem. And now that we have somebody in the White House who can walk and chew gum at the same time and says that his administration will reflect the constituencies that got him elected, indeed, help might be on the way.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. And we want America to know that Congressman Benny Thompson is our Chairman of Homeland Security. Thank you so much. At this time, let me say thank you to all of you who gave testimony as witnesses. And now we will move quickly into our 1-minute congressional statements. For those who aren't aware of this, this is a tradition that we do on the United States House floor. So the Congressional Black Caucus will be doing it. Our message, our power. Our power, our message. Congressman Stephen Horsford.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. This is our power, and this is our message. Last deadly insurrection put a spotlight on the damage caused by 4 years under a racist and dangerous president. This moment in history calls on us to act. We will impeach Donald Trump, continue congressional oversight to investigate and examine the events of January 6th, and begin the hard work of reforming our institutions to build back a better future for all Americans. In the first 100 days The Biden-Harris administration, the Congressional Black Caucus, will work with our partners in the civil rights community to fight for policies like our Jobs and Justice Bill, which will create economic opportunity for Black Americans and work to crush this virus. We will fight to make our justice system fair for all. And together, we will insist on a society in which Black lives are fully valued. This is our power and our message.
Thank you, Congressman Horsford, and thank you to our amazing chair and soror, and to all the sorors out there, happy Founders Day. Many of you have asked the question, how did this happen? What are we going to do about it? And I stand here strong today with this is our voice and our message that we are committed as a Congressional Black Caucus to shine a light on every aspect of this awful attack on our democracy.
After Brenda.
Have shown throughout history that the Black is the conscience of the country, and we will use our voice to be sure that the voice of Black America is heard. I was one of those being told to shelter on the floor, being given a gas mask and rushed off the floor. This is serious. People have died, and just God's grace kept us all alive. I want you all to know that today's hearing is very timely and it's important. And as we continue with our voice at this time, I would like to recognize the gentle lady and a soror of mine from Florida, the Congresswoman Val Demings, to continue our power and our message.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our special guests. As you all know,
Who's after Val? After me.
In law enforcement, I have worked rallies involving the neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, and other white supremacist groups. I know policing and the special relationship that should exist, and in many places does exist within law enforcement and the community. I want to make two things clear. Number one, the violence that we witnessed in the Capitol was the culmination of the calls for violence over the past 5 years from the president, supported by his enablers. Number two, the police officers on the front lines who fought for us, one to his death, deserve our appreciation. And it's okay to separate the good ones from the bad ones. However, for any police officers who may have conspired, coordinated, participated in the breach of the Capitol, the violence, the insurrection, deserve to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. To those who came from other jurisdictions and allegedly flashed their badges to gain illegal entry must be fired and prosecuted. We cannot control their hearts, but we can modify their behavior, and we will do everything possible to hold anyone and everyone accountable. Again, Madam Chair, thank you so much. It is at this time that I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Val. I'm Congressman Anthony Brown of Maryland and currently the Vice Chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Insurrectionists desecrating our Capitol, the center of American democracy, should shock and anger all of us. While Army Secretary McCarthy said officials couldn't envision rioters breaching Capitol grounds in their wildest imaginations, there were warning signs. Mayor Bowser, as we heard earlier, explicitly requested National Guard support for the large crowds because of expectations of violence and criminal behavior. The Pentagon responded, yet prohibited the use of riot gear, the sharing of equipment with local law enforcement, and any interaction with protesters. After President Trump ordered the rioters down Pennsylvania Avenue, requests to redeploy the Guard from around the city were denied and delayed. Army leaders stated that they didn't like the visual of the National Guard on Capitol Hill, and as a result, instead we witnessed the imagery of our democracy being ransacked and overrun by a mob. 86 minutes after the first call went to the Pentagon, Acting Defense Secretary Miller finally authorized assistance to quell the insurrection. By this time, an officer who suffered injuries had died, the Senate was breached, and the American flag had been replaced by the flags of the Confederacy and Donald Trump. Currently, the District of Columbia National Guard is led by the Commander-in-Chief, the President. This is the only scenario in our country
where a governor or mayor does not have control over the guard. The man that incited riot was supposed to protect and send the guard to the District of Columbia. It did not happen. I call on all of us to support Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill to transfer authority of the National Guard for the District of Columbia from the president to the mayor. This is our power. This is our message.
Thank you, Congressman Anthony Brown. At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the Congressman Andre Carson.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you, CBC colleagues and guests. As a former police officer and a senior member of the House Intelligence Committee, I've been warning the public for years that the biggest national security threat we face is domestic terrorism from white nationalists. We all know that if the attackers on the Capitol had been Black, they would have been arrested and probably shot. Just yesterday, I learned that my name was on a list of good guys and bad guys in the red truck of the domestic terrorist who was just indicted. He had an arsenal of ammunition and large quantities of explosives. Unfortunately, I didn't learn I was targeted and in danger from this terrorist, from the U.S. Capitol Police, or from any law enforcement officials who were supposed to protect and serve. I learned from a reporter after the indictment was released. There's a problem here. We have to address white supremacy in the White House, in law enforcement, and across the country among disaffected people who have been hoodwinked by those peddling racism and division instead of leading us to form a more perfect union and a more just system for all people. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Congressman. At this time, I would like to yield 1 minute to the Honorable Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. As a Black woman in America, feeling unsafe is certainly not new. For us, a foundational sense of safety and security has never existed. The terror of a violent white supremacist mob is not new in America, a place where Black skin alone is often a crime punishable by death. The threat of white supremacy for many was only made real, however, when it arrived at the steps of the United States Capitol in the form of an armed insurrection. Donald Trump and the hate he emboldens are a clear and present threat to our democracy and our very lives. He must be immediately removed from office, but make no mistake, this did not start with him and it will not end with him. White supremacy courses deep through our institutions, it is codified into our laws, and it is exacted on Black bodies. The work of unlearning and uprooting homegrown hate begins with the immediate impeachment and removal of Trump and the expulsion of his accomplices. But it will not be complete until we've untethered every colonial and imperial tie that binds us to the dark history of our nation's founding. Our power, our message. I yield.
Thank you, Congresswoman. At this time, Madam Chair, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the amazing leader of Barbara Lee, Chair of Steering and Policy.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Lawrence, and I want to thank our Congressional Black Caucus and our chair really for first continuing to be the conscience of the Congress, and also Chairwoman Beatty, thank you for your incredible leadership. You truly have come for such a time as this. The attempted coup last week is just the latest manifestation of dangerous and violent white supremacy embedded in America's DNA. Donald Trump has spent the last 4 years stoking fires of white nationalism amongst his supporters. He's peddling and has peddled conspiracy theories and lies in an effort to incite an insurrection against our government, overturn the results of an election, and deny the will of the American people. This happened not secretly, but in plain sight. The events of last week were planned publicly, encouraged by Trump publicly, and carried out confidently without restraint by these white supremacist insurrections. There's no question that our Capitol security leadership was unprepared for this. The question is why, especially after a summer when we saw a militarized presence, fully equipped with tear gas, rubber bullets, and tanks facing civilians, demanded justice for Black people in America. Yet when a violent mob of white supremacists, Trump supporters, carry out a coup attempt and breach the Capitol building, we saw law enforcement completely overwhelmed. Black Capitol police officers told me that they bravely fought and I know this, to protect us, the building, and themselves. And they were in combat with white supremacists. Given America's deep-rooted history of white supremacy and white nationalism in policing, this is no surprise. Quite frankly, there are two Americas, one where Black people are murdered for walking or driving or sleeping, and one where white people are allowed to operate with complete disrespect.
Congresswoman Lee. At this time, we will bring forth our representative from Florida, Congresswoman Wilson. Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia. Unmute. Mr. Johnson, will you unmute?
I'm sorry. Madam Chair, the terror inflicted upon our democracy last week by killers was more acute for Black and brown people because this was not the first time in our history that we as a body politic have come under physical assault. Last week, a white supremacist mob stormed the United States Capitol. They paraded flags of the Confederacy, flags of terror in support of a racist president. This menacing lynch mob, stirred into a frenzy by a maniac and his seditious co-conspirators, were met with flaccid law enforcement resistance upon their arrival. The difference in treatment between those white nationalists and the peaceful protesters marching for black life was a vivid illustration of what it's like to be Black in America, just as was the 8-minute and 46-second live streamed video of the death of George Floyd, which proved to white people the glaring need for police reform. Last summer, we watched as protesters were met with a turbo-militarized police response to peaceful protesters who came to DC to tell America that Black lives matter. This is America. White America must acknowledge what Black Americans live every day. Systemic racism must be rooted out of this country, or else the freedom that should be enjoyed by all citizens will be no more. This is our voice. This is our power. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Congressman Hank Johnson. And at this time, we do have Congresswoman Frederica Wilson back. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you to our amazing chair and all the members of the Congressional Black Caucus. The Census Project that we just went through projects that in 2045, white people will become the minority in the United States. Everything that we have seen in this country for the last 400 years up until last Wednesday has been driven by that fact. The insanity and brutality that we have seen in this country only makes sense when we understand white people's fear of extinction. For them, white power equals white supremacy, and white supremacy is only achievable with numerical dominance. In their minds, the rise in the Black and brown population threatens their very existence. That fear that white people have of losing power drives them to extremes to kill and incarcerate as many Black and brown people as possible to maintain their majority status. What we saw play out at the Capitol on January 6th is just a continuation of that effort. It started long before, when slave patrols were created to brutalize and kill Black men after slavery. White fear of extinction has shown itself in Black men being castrated by angry white mobs because the white men were afraid Black men's ability to procreate. It manifests itself in putting millions of Black and brown men in prison during their prime reproductive years. It's manifested itself in the raw hatred spewed at a Black president because he represented the loss of white power. It manifests itself in dog whistle slogans like "Make America Great Again," which really means make America white again. It manifests itself in putting brown and black babies in cages. It manifests itself in building walls on our borders. It manifests itself in bans on Muslims entering the country. It manifests themselves on the onslaught of TPS. To the white supremacists, these actions must be taken because every new black and brown immigrant hates.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Congresswoman. At this time, we're going to wrap up our witnesses with the last 30 seconds for Barbara Lee from California.
Thank you. Can you hear me now, Madam
Yes.
Chair? Okay, let me just conclude by just saying how awesome this Black Caucus is. And I wanted to quote our friend Wade Henderson. I'm not sure if you heard his quote that I was presenting, but I want to repeat this. Everything we saw, Wade said, at the US Capitol on January 6th was exactly who we are, because it's the product of who we have always been. He said, until we face that truth, we will never, ever change it. And so, Madam Chair, members, those who are listening and with us today, we have to have this moment of reckoning about the systems in place that perpetuate blatant injustice. The Congressional Black Caucus will continue fighting tirelessly to dismantle systemic racism and white supremacy. Fortunately, 1 week from today, we will have a new administration will make that goal far easier. And as the scriptures do remind us that the light always outshines the darkness. Now I will turn it back to our remarkable and brilliant Chairwoman Joyce Beatty for closing remarks.
Hello, I want to thank everyone for their witnesses. I want on the record that we cannot have healing and unity without accountability and justice. The President of the United States incited a violent insurgence against Congress and his own Vice President. This cannot be ignored. Madam Chair, I yield back to you with all of the witnesses for your closing remarks.
Thank you so much. That was our second Vice President, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence. Let me just say thank you. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Thank you to all of our members of Congress for speaking to our power, our message. But what our message is at this time is we are not done. We are just beginning. We will go to the United States House floor and we will vote to impeach Donald Trump. We will continue to report out to you on all of our findings. We will tell you our next steps. And we also want you to stay tuned because we will be rolling out our first 100 days from the Congressional Black Caucus, the conscience of the Congress. Stay tuned. God bless you. Our power, our message. You heard it from us. Our power, our message. Thank you. Now, we will be holding a press conference for all of the press who are on with us today, and that will start in 2 minutes. Thank you.